Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you to Soldier Speaks English, and I've got a very special guest with me today. Phil Sutcliffe is here. Let me just introduce him a bit. He's agreed. He does not want me to, give him a grandstanding introduction, but
Oh
he
no.
does. Yeah, but he deserves it, in my opinion. So here it goes. Over a career spanning more than 4 decades, Phil has written for many of the UK's most respected publications, including The Guardian, Q Magazine, Mojo, Sounds, and Los Angeles Times. He's interviewed some of the biggest names in music and culture, from Queen, U2, and Bruce Springsteen to emerging artists who went on to change the sound of their generation. Beyond entertainment, and journalism, Phil's reporting and features have explored the social and political forces that shape art, identity, and freedom of expression. He's also the author of acclaimed books such as Queen, The Ultimate Illustrated History of the Crown Kings of Rock, and AC/DC, High Voltage Rock and Roll. Ladies and gentlemen, in this conversation, we'll talk about his remarkable career, the evolution of British journalism, and the changing relationship between press, politics, and culture in the digital age. And we will also focus on British influence over South Asian subcontinent and its politics. So, first of all, I'd like to welcome Phil. How are you doing? How are you today?
Oh, fine, Adil. Very fine, really. Quite oddly busy for an old bloke, but in good condition, really.
Yeah, but you always, I see you at the forefront at the National Union of Journalists meeting, and you're the go-to man for everyone, especially for the journalists in trouble. So that's why I troubled you with this interview. Phil, you have worked across several eras of British journalism, from
Mm.
the print age to digital media. How has the role and responsibility of journalists changed during this time?
Oh, good Lord. That's such a big question. I mean, I feel the changes more in the practicalities, you know. So I started off, I was an apprentice on a local paper called the Evening Chronicle in Newcastle. That was my training. And I started off on a typewriter with 5 layers of carbon paper. And we would type the news onto, you had to stick it all together first of all, which was always cumbersome, and you're always dropping it all over the place. So, you know, those things, they really make a difference to your life. I don't know if they make a difference to your journalism. I mean, the next wave of big change was mid 80s when we started to write on computers, uh, little old Amstrads. That's what we began with in the UK anyway. Alan Sugar's company, Lord Sugar, I should say. Now, and so that was a strange feeling, and yet it was still a bit like working on a typewriter, but just words came up on a screen instead of on a piece of paper. And then, of course, the internet started to creep into things, but I only really got caught up in that when the LA Times, who you mentioned, um, called me up one week and said, "Look, we don't want you to keep on faxing your stories to us. We want you to get email. You must get email. It's so much easier." And so I said, "Oh, right, I will then." And that's what started me into the wacky world of kind of Apple Macs and being online and us being here, able to talk to each other and see each other at the same time. Good Lord, you know. So those are the things that really I feel have made it, well, they've made an impression on me. What can I say? As I've told you, I do try to avoid generalization because it always seems so fallible. I just hate to do it. But that, yeah, the technical changes happen a lot. Now, of course, I think the internet must be what's made a big difference to how journalism reaches people. So it's only in those latter years, in my case since about 1998, when you get onto the internet, that the way of communicating with people becomes so different because you start to reach people You've no idea who they are, where they are. Now, how do you deal with that? Well, to me, and I'm 78 years old. I'm an old-fashioned fellow. To me, the same responsibilities in journalism apply, whether you're writing, in a sense, whether you're writing about music, art stuff, like I did for many years, or whether you're covering other topics, which are considered in many ways more serious, because they're about real life, politics and wars and all that kind of stuff. The responsibility stays the same, I think. What do you think, Adil?
Yeah, I think you're right, but I cannot simply, try to. It's like in South Asia, they say that you're trying to show the mirror to the sun, your experience, the what you've seen. I mean, that I just cannot imagine because I come from a different background. I was a soldier in military. Now
Yeah.
I'm a journalist, and my genre is also politics. That's South
Mm,
Asian politics. So
mm,
I'm it's a learning curve for me. That's
yeah.
why I wanted you to come, and that's why I wanted to talk about it. So, Phil, you've written for Guardian, Q, and
No,
Mojo.
I have to correct you there. I never wrote for The Guardian.
Oh, you never. All right.
I never did. I'd love to
Oh,
have.
all
But
right.
I
So,
actually never even pitched at them. I should say to people that have I? I'm a freelance, so you do have to pitch your work all the time, as opposed to
all
just
right.
doing what you're told every week and collecting your wages at the end of the week, which
All
is
right.
why part of why I liked freelancing, I suppose. Although there's a lot of appeal in the security of getting wages at the end of the week, isn't there, Adil? I'm sure there is.
So, which all media outlets have you not worked for, but published your work as a journalist?
As a journalist, well, it was loads of music magazines. It was those local papers in Newcastle and Evening Chronicle, the Journal, the Northern Echo. They were big time daily newspapers in their regions. Papers that were selling 250,000 a day. Imagine.
Hmm,
Now they, I think the Evening Chronicle doesn't even print anymore.
yeah.
And so huge switch. And at the same time as not printing, of course, online they're available if they can get the eyeballs. They're available to far more people. They're available, and I hope they're getting there, to the Geordie diaspora. Um, Thinking of you not of you broadcasting to people who aren't in England and don't know these things. Geordies are people who live in the Newcastle area, so that's what I was talking about there. And so you've got this fantastic reach, and does fantastic reach also go along with perhaps loss of focus in some sense? I don't know. But these are things we're learning all the time, aren't they? I mean, I don't know these things at all. It's all new and it's changing, changing, changing with AI as the latest factor, which looks like it's going to really mess with things and probably make journalism more difficult, less
Hmm,
reliable,
yeah.
because you don't know who's addressing you and what sources they're using, whether it's a real human being or a bloody machine. It's God. How do people deal with that? How do we deal with it, and how do our readerships, audiences deal with it?
So, Phil, in a way, you have already answered my second question, but
Have
still,
I?
I'll
Oh,
ask. Yeah, I'll still ask you. You work for these mega outlets, all right, regional outlets and mega outlets, uh, which are known for both cultural and social commentary. Now,
yeah.
how did that mix of art, politics, and society shape your view of the journalist's duty to the public? Journalist has still got a duty to the public, isn't it? So,
Or
how do you think? What is the view of the journalist's duty to the public?
well, I think that has stayed largely the same. I've always been a socialist of some sort, probably. Oh, my best description of my politics is an Attlee socialist, which of course relates to uh, British history of within my lifetime. When I was born in 1947, Clement Attlee was the Prime Minister. He was a Labour Prime Minister. He was the most radical, I would say, Prime Minister we've ever had. And to my limited view, 1945 to 50 Labour government was the peak of British civilization. It brought in the NHS, National Health Service. It brought in free school education and free university education. And it did a lot of nationalisations, which were beneficial in their day and which we lost in the Thatcher era.
You said free university education as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
We
wow.
were given grants to go to university, man.
Grants, not loans.
Not loans. No,
Oh,
the education was free. We had no fees to pay. Amazing, isn't it? Now it just seems amazing. We had no fees to pay, and we were given grants. And my parents were they didn't have any money to spare, put it that way, and they were very relieved that I got a grant. Back in those days, I think it was £900 a year, which could feed you and clothe you for the year easily back then. You know, these things are all relative, of course, but that was the point. The grant would feed you and clothe you. The university gave you the education. Your accommodation was paid in there somewhere. I forget whether we paid the accommodation out of the grant or whether that was the university paid it. But anyway, it was covered. It cost me almost nothing personally, and my parents almost nothing, for me to go to university for 4 years. And so that was one of the things that arose out of the Attlee period. Of course, also my healthcare all the way through to now by the NHS. Not for free exactly, of course, that's a misstatement, but paid for through taxes, so that it is all about redistribution of the nation's wealth. You pay it through taxes, that means a redistribution of wealth, and that's how you do the provision of free facilities like that. And it was just wonderful. And I grew up through a consensus of Labour and Liberal Tories, notably a Tory PM called Harold Macmillan. And throughout that period, all the way up to Margaret Thatcher in 1979, she came in. Nobody interfered or in any way thought of withdrawing any of those services or renationalising any of those major industries. The energy industry, for instance, gas, electricity. We'd nationalised telephones. That may not be so crucial, but we nationalised telephones. British Telecom used to be a nationalised company. It's now a private company. And so I grew up with all of that for the first 20, almost 30 years of my life. And so that set the tone for me. And although my parents were actually Tory voters, nonetheless, the way things worked, I ended up being a liberal socialist by the time I reached my teens, I think. And so my journalism has always operated in that context. And I've always, even when I was writing about rock music in all its dimensions, a delightful subject, and which, it's an art, of course it is. And the artists are interesting, great interviews you do reviews and all that. So my approach to all of that was absolutely from this liberal socialist point of view, liberal in an ancient sense, I suspect, as the meaning of it has got all twisted in all sorts of ways since then. And so I was always interested in the social effects of whatever art I was writing about, and anything that I was involved in as a journalist, was, so how is this going to, well, the art can just elevate you for a time. It can even give you ideas that help you more widely through life. But it's also a matter of how it's addressing these important matters of the way we live. And one good thing about when I went into music journalism about 80 to 90% of my time in the 70s was the punk movement came up. Do you know about the punk movement, Adil?
I've just read about it, and I've
Oh, you
seen
have?
those I've seen those posters, and the hairstyles still fascinate me of the punk movement.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But it was very, I wouldn't say it was revolutionary, although some of its statements were. Uh, and let me quote you. Some of your listeners will, not viewers, I should say, will know about this, and some will have no clue. Um, the leading punk band in the mid-70s was called the Sex Pistols, and the very first hit record they came out with, it was a number one hit, you know. It was very noisy and very aggressive, but um, uh, the song began with the words, "God save the Queen, the fascist regime made me a moron." How's that? Does that hit you
Wow.
between the eyes?
Wow, it does. It does. Wasn't it censored back then?
No, not much anyway. I think some radio stations did refuse to play it as loyalists to the Queen or just generally feeling these dirty people shouldn't be on the air, you know. And it was an aggressive,
Yeah.
unlovely noise they made, for sure. It was really rocking as well. Big guitars, you know, so it was hard hitting in a relatively traditional sense. Um, but yeah, they got through. They had a famous TV confrontation with an old interviewer, now departed, I think, called Bill Grundy, where they started swearing on the BBC, you know, and you absolutely couldn't do that back now. That's changed a bit. You can now. But that was a peak of controversy because the leader, who called himself Johnny Rotten, that was his stage name, you know. John Lydon was his real name. But he was just so confrontational with Bill Grundy, and Bill Grundy responded like an old person, like I probably would have, even then. And, you know, so it was a great conflagration that made the front page of the papers the following day. So that was a big turning point of post-hippie music moving into its own new era of approaching uh, the political. Of course, hippie music in the 60s had been very political in itself, very associated with, on the one hand, the civil rights movement and all of that, and on the other, with drugs. Uh, and so these things come in waves, and they're always fascinating, and it's always saying, well, on the whole, and very in waves through cultural history, young people's music gets very radical. You hope it's going to be radical in the right, i.e., left way. Well, of course, it can be used by the right wing just as much. It can be. Hasn't really been much in the UK. Hasn't been. Not sure why that is, but it's a good thing.
Yeah. So, Phil, this journey of last 7 decades,
Yeah.
I need to know before we move on to South Asia and before how it, what the we move on to the brass tacks. I just wanted to ask you because it's a question of interest that in last 7 decades, do you think the censorship and the media control and freedom of expression has gone under intense scrutiny, or you've got now more liberty to do your work as a journalist and as a writer? What do you think about that?
Well, in my experience, it went along fairly on a flat plane where you had an enormous amount of freedom in most areas. I just mentioned one where you didn't, you couldn't swear, and now you can. I don't think that's of tremendous importance, but it is a little further step in terms of freedom of speech, saying exactly what you want, you know. Um, but mostly it was keep the balance and all that, and the idea of keeping the balance, striving for the balance. You'd never achieve it. Striving for balanced journalism in certainly in political areas and so on. Arts areas, you were much freer not to be balanced. But political journalism, the objective and what I was trained in and grew up with and practiced whenever I was in that area, was balanced journalism, and that is still an ideal, and it's still striven for, and it's still always controversial, of course, because it's just essentially going to be imperfect, because we are but little human beings plying our trade, trying to execute our craft to the best of our ability, writers, photographers, as the case may be, and so it's really tricky. However, at the moment, we're in one of those dips in freedom, definitely, and there is a lot of pressure on. Not as bad in England as it UK, I should say, as it is in USA, and of course several other countries where right-wing regimes have come in. Of course, I'm very aware of various left-wing regimes down the years who have also been oppressive to freedom of speech, and specifically to journalists. But at the moment, it is in a difficulty, in different ways. Here, it's couched in a really fundamentally pea-brained terms of the culture wars, which to me are an almost non-existent framework for politicians and some sociologists and whatnot to bang on about stuff that really doesn't exist, is largely phantasmagorical. On the other hand, on the extreme other hand, if you look at, Gaza is obviously the case in point, much though we've just had the partial peace agreement, and everyone hopes it'll work somewhere or another if it possibly can. But Gaza was the extreme anti-freedom of speech, but particularly in the field of journalism. It was an extreme, may become an extreme again. Number one, because outside journalists, the world's journalists, were excluded, and this is, I don't gather that this has ever been done in a war before, I may be wrong, was excluded from reporting on the spot. What a restriction of freedom that is. And on the other hand, of course, because the Palestinian journalists, ergo the only journalists who were there on the spot, were constantly being menaced, and worse than that, they were being killed. Well over 200 entirely documented deaths of Palestinian journalists. And talk about a chilling effect. Audience, I don't know if you are familiar with the phrase chilling effect. It was originally used to describe the effect of some libel cases in the UK, where you take a libel case and the effect of it is to silence debate on that topic, because somebody gets £1 million ordered against them, and so no other journos and other people, of course, don't want to get into it because they might be bankrupted, basically. I know Adil knows about all this stuff very well, and very recently, currently indeed. But so the chilling effect in Palestine, which in that desperate situation didn't actually seem to work. The idea was to stop Palestinians reporting on what was happening to them, just as you'd stopped outside journalists reporting because they couldn't get in. The extraordinary thing is that, and this is again is partly, no, almost entirely due to the internet, it didn't work because the Palestinians, who with unexpressible courage carried on doing their journalism, despite the death of 200 of them, which must be an extraordinary percentage of the journalists in Palestine, a very small country, and they were able, because of the internet, to cooperate with the Westerners sitting across the border, and the Westerners sitting, I shouldn't say Westerners, of course, I mean people across the world, who otherwise would have been so blocked out of this, it's unimaginable. I mean, I edited my dad's book of his experiences of the First World War. Just think how little we'd know about the First World War if journalists had been excluded. That was one of the very first, one of the early classic eras of reportage on war from the trenches, actually in the trenches. Reporters and photographers did get in there, you know. We know a hell of a lot about the First World War all over the fighting areas. In Gaza, we see something totally different, but we also see the fantastic resource of people who are actually there, the people who live there, they're journalists doing the reporting. And so I guess here's a crazy thought. Was reporting from Gaza better because it was done by Palestinians almost entirely, although relayed by the journos of other nations? But was it better than if those outsiders had come in? I don't know, but it's a thought, and I suppose that will be digested in the coming years, and people may turn much more to what we call local journalists, the people on the spot, as opposed to flying in John Simpson to who's a brilliant journalist, but you know he's is he the global correspondent of the BBC or something? What a title, you know. So he goes into a place, he's flown in, literally and metaphorically, and describes what's going on from his vast background of knowledge, history, and current affairs, and then describes things. But in some ways, he's substituting for the local journalists, and that balance. That's another balance that we have to strike much better, I think, now and in the future. I think it is really shifting for economic reasons, in part. All the big media corporations, they don't like to pay journalists in their own countries because we're expensive. So big incentive to getting their journalism much more globalized, much more diversified, and acknowledging the value of journalists who are on the spot is because they save money. They pay them at whatever Palestinian rates might be, or whatever South African rates might be, Indian rates. Adil will know about Indian rates, but and Pakistani rates, whatever, wherever in the world.
We'll come to that in the second part. Yes.
Whoops, sorry. Is this is an unorthodox interlude? My cat, excuse me.
What's her or his name? Your cat's name?
He's called Marcel. Not a name I chose, but he is. We inherited him.
Marcel wants to be interviewed, I suppose.
I think he probably wants his food, actually. But so can I break for 2 minutes to feed him?
Yeah, sure. So this is the end of part one. Just one final question. Just one final question of part one. Phil, as a lifelong journalist who's at 78 years of age now, why do you think UK is considered the libel tourism capital of the world?
Yeah, it's been like that for a while. The libel laws were made a little easier for journalists a few years ago.
But it's not working, Phil, is it?
Well, it's not entirely working. There may have been a little benefit from the reform of the libel law a few years ago, but no, it's not. I suppose slaps are the major existing problem.
Let's break for the first part over here. Yeah, so we'll continue after the break for the second part, ladies and gentlemen. Stay tuned for the second part. Thank you so very much, Phil. We'll continue from where we're leaving now.
I'll come back after I've fed the cat.
Sure. Thank you.
What a noise.